What do sunscreen and Star Trek have in common? Have you ever wondered what SPF really stands for? Are you unsure what the fuss is all about with chemical versus mineral sunscreen? Then this episode is for you. Welcome to the Secret Life of Numbers podcast, the podcast where we dissect everyday numbers and statistics to find the stories behind them.
Each episode, we take a number or statistic and break it down. We will tell you where it came from and what it means for you. Along the way, hopefully we will inspire you to think about the numbers in your own life.
I'm Levannia, your data scientist on call. I'll be breaking down the numbers.
I'm Lindsay, your data translator, for when Levannia gets too technical on us. I'll be breaking down the rest.
All right, let's jump in. So, Lindsay, we both wear sunscreen every day, right? But I think we wear it for different reasons, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, so I am super pale. You can see a picture of us on our Instagram at The Secret Life of Numbers, and we have a little About Us section on there. And I have actually gotten a sunburn in like pretty much every month of the year. So I have to wear sunscreen even if I'm going skiing, for example, because it's a risk.
And what SPF do you wear?
So for just daily wear year round, I go for SPF 30. And then in the summer, Neutrogena has this SPF 110 sunscreen, which sounds totally overkill, but it's my personal favorite because it's the highest SPF I've been able to find.
I certainly don't wear SPF 110. I think the highest I've gone to is SPF 40. And really, that's just because I don't want wrinkles.
Which is totally legitimate. And it's also a fringe benefit of, wearing it every day is in 30 years, we will be looking very firm. Yeah. So what we're really saying is that we see the number 30, for example, in SPF 30 every day. But we didn't really know what it means. What is SPF 30? What does SPF even mean? So, Levannia, what is SPF 30? What does SPF even mean?
Well, Lindsay, that's what we'll be talking about in the numbers section. So, SPF is an acronym, and it stands for Sun Protection Factor. And this is basically a measure of how much UV radiation, and in particular UVB radiation, which is one of the types of radiation given off by the sun, penetrates through the filter created by your sunscreen. So what this means is it relates how much time it takes for your skin to burn without protection to how long it would take your skin to burn with protection, if your sunscreen was perfectly applied.
The key there is perfectly applied. Let's be honest. We all just slapdash that on and then go out in the sun. Realistically, it's not going to be perfectly applied.
Yeah, and I think at least what I've learned in my research is perfectly applied means 2 milligrams of sunscreen per centimeter squared.
So I don't know about you, but I don't weigh the sunscreen before I put it on. I'm just like, okay, it looks good enough. I guess I'll go out now.
Yeah, and that number actually comes from one of the ISO, which stands for International Standards Organization standards that we will review.
Interesting. Yeah. I wonder how they got to that number.
Just to start, I'll just give an overview of some of the types of UV radiation because there are different types that can have different effects on your skin. There are 3 main types of UV radiation. UV ranges in wavelength from 100 to 400 nanometers. For reference, visible light ranges from 400 to 700 nanometers. UVA has a range of 315 to 400 nanometers, and UVB has a range from 280 to 315 nanometers, while UVC has a range from 100 to 280. Did I get that right, Lindsay?
Yes, you got all those numbers right. That was awesome. One of the questions I always have when I hear the different wavelengths is, what does that mean for me, right?
Mm-hmm.
How is that UV affecting me if it's a different wavelength. So we looked into it, and when we talk about wavelength, it does have an impact for what that radiation has the potential to do to our skin. So UVB specifically is often the culprit when it comes to sunburns. And that's why specifically SPF is traditionally geared towards filtering out UVB, because it's kind of an immediate consequence, right? You go out in the sun, you come back looking like a lobster, you're a little bit, sore, tired, fried. So that's the one that's often covered by SPF. But then UVA is sometimes forgotten if your sunscreen isn't broad spectrum. And UVA is the one that leads to skin aging, wrinkles, and ultimately skin damage. And it can also cause sunburns, but it's more that deep damage that we're seeing with UVA. So that's why it's really important to have broad spectrum sunscreen, because you want to make sure you're covering both those ranges and getting the maximum benefit out of your sunscreen.
So what you're saying is that I should check the sunscreen that I'm wearing, because if I care about the wrinkles and it's not broad spectrum, I'm not really doing anything for my wrinkles.
I mean, it's more of a gradient, like anything, right? But you want to make sure you're getting broad spectrum. You want to make sure you're covering UVA, UVB.
What about UVC?
I'm so glad you asked. So UVC radiation actually reacts with the ozone in the atmosphere, and it doesn't usually reach the ground, although there are some holes in the ozone layer. So it's often something we don't have to worry about every day. People who do have to worry about UVC radiation are, for example, people who are welders, because UVC is emitted from welding torches. Other sources are mercury lamps or UV sanitizing bulbs. So it's something to be aware of, but in terms of those harmful effects, it's not going to be our big ticket item getting us to a place of a lot of skin damage. So we've talked a little bit about the ratio that we use to calculate SPF, but Levannia, what does SPF 30 really mean?
So what it means for SPF 30 is if you weren't wearing sunscreen, your skin would burn 30 times faster than if you were wearing sunscreen.
So the opposite is it takes 30 times longer to burn if you're wearing the sunscreen versus not. But I guess it comes back to perfectly applied, right?
Once again, yes, if you are perfectly applied.
And everyone's skin is different too in terms of how long it takes to burn.
Yes, and then based on the way that we do test for SPF, you should be reapplying every 2 hours.
Makes sense. And also after sweating or swimming.
Yes, exactly, because then you've just washed it all away. So, Lindsay, how does sunscreen actually work? How does it create this filter or this protection for us on our skin?
That's a great question that actually brings us back to how did we get to SPF, right? Like anything else, it's something that had to be invented or discovered. So the very first study that we see on sunscreen efficacy is from 1934, and it's by a man called Friedrich Ellinger. And basically, they used mercury lamps to determine the minimal erythemal dose, which is like the minimum dose to get redness or a sunburn.
Yes. In the regulations, they define it as the minimum dose to get erythemal redness with defined edges.
Yes. So they were comparing that using a mercury lamp for protected versus unprotected skin. And they actually, the author of the paper, Mr. Ellinger, they used his own forearms for the testing, which I think is just so old school, hardcore science, And basically later on, there was another man called Rudolf Schultz, and he calculated a protection factor used to evaluate the sunscreens that were available. He called it the Schultz factor, and it was just to give consumers an idea of the level of protection. And it's very similar to what we now refer to as SPF, because it compared that time for burn, unprotected versus unprotected skin. In 1974, we had Franz Greider. I'm so sorry. I don't know how to exactly pronounce the name. Basically, he came along and he renamed the Schultz factor as SPF. And then it became this population measure but it wasn't totally standardized. So in 1978, the FDA adopted it and used it as a standard measure.
Schultz factor sounds so much cooler than SPF, Lindsay. Like, it would just be so much cooler if I was like, I'm wearing Schultz factor 50 today.
Yes. I'm reminded of Mean Girls. I feel like they'd just say like, oh, that's so fetch. I'm wearing Schultz factor 60. So we've talked a bit about where we've been, the history of SPF, how we went from Schultz factor, which objectively is a much cooler name than sun protection factor, to now sun protection factor. And we've talked a little bit about SPF 30 and what that number means, but I'm still wondering about these standards for testing. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Levannia?
For sure. So I did some research, and there are 3 ISO standards. And ISO, as I said before, stands for the International Standards Organization. And they create these standards that are then used by your health organizations like the FDA and Health Canada to regulate the numbers that you see on your sunscreen bottles. So the 3 that I found were ISO 24444, ISO 24443, and ISO 24442. And just to give, I guess, a brief overview of what one of these documents contains, we can go through some of the steps for 24444, which is just your regular UVB protection sunscreen.
Can I just say, those names just roll off the tongue.
Oh,
they
yeah.
are so descriptive. I wonder how they came up with them.
Wait, let me look up what the actual title is for 24444. Okay, so it's ISO International Standard 24444, Cosmetics Sun Protection Test Methods, in vivo determination of the sun protection factor.
Again, it just rolls off the tongue.
Doesn't that sound like some good reading?
Yes, a good fast food reading, as you say.
So in broad strokes, what happens is you get some volunteers, you put some sunscreen on their backs, you expose them to some UV light, and then you measure after a period of time if they have a sunburn. And then the major steps that we can go through are there's an acclimatization period for the skin of your volunteers. Then you determine the ITA degree, and this relates to the color of their skin and will tell you how much UV light you should expose them to. So then you outline the test sites on the back of your subjects. And this is where we get into perfectly applied, because you're outlining centimeter squared spots on the skin to apply exactly 2 milligrams of sunscreen. Then you weigh out the product, you apply it, you expose your subject, you wait, and then you do your minimal erythemal dosage assessment. And then there's some calculations afterward to get your SPF values.
Wow. So there's a lot that goes into it, right? Like, a company can't just say, it's SPF 50, but it's not really SPF 50.
You're absolutely right. So in this regulation, we'll talk about, I guess, sample size. So how many people or how many volunteers are being tested. In ISO 24444, you have a minimum of 10 and a maximum of 20 people that you can test. And what they're doing is they're exposing these 10 people or minimum 10 people to UV light, and then they're calculating the SPF. And then in order to, I guess, validate that your SPF is what they say it is, we have to determine a confidence interval on that mean value. Do you know what a confidence interval is, Lindsay?
I am 95% confident that I know what a confidence interval is.
All right, hit me.
Okay. So my understanding is that with a 95% confidence interval, what we're saying is that we're 95% confident that the true parameter, like in this case, the true SPF of that sunscreen is between whatever our interval bounds are. So like if our bounds are, 20 to 25, SPF 20 to 25, we're 95% confident that our true SPF is within that range.
Exactly. You don't even need a data scientist on call.
I think I still do. I really think I do.
Do you know why we can make that claim, though? What are some of the assumptions that we think about or that we make when we make that claim?
We're assuming that there's a normal distribution of that parameter.
Exactly. And I don't know if I want to quiz you more, but can you tell me 2 things about a normal distribution?
Okay, so a normal distribution for our listeners who maybe are having trouble visualizing what that looks like is it looks like that stereotypical bell curve.
Exactly.
I think it's 67% of the values will fall within one standard deviation of the mean.
It's 68%.
68. Oh, I was so close.
So close.
Okay. But then 95% fall within 2 standard deviations of the mean. And then the mean is also right at the center.
Right at the top.
At the peak, I guess we could say, of the bell curve.
Yes. To sum it all up, all of this it's also symmetrical.
Yes, hence the bell. One question I have, though, is this seems really counterintuitive to what we normally look for in studies, like scientific studies. We look for big sample sizes to get us close to this truth, to get us that confidence interval. So why do we have such a small sample size when we're testing SPF?
So the reason they can have such a small sample size is because the pass-fail criteria is that whatever confidence interval they calculate, it has to be less than 17% of the mean SPF that they calculate for their sunscreen. So what they're doing there is they're controlling that range. So it can't be too wide around the mean that you say it is, or else that mean means nothing.
So they're giving you a really narrow confidence interval you have to be within. And that's not saying it's certain numbers on either side, but based on what you're getting, you have to have all of those results very close together to pass the testing.
Exactly. So if you think about this, you could test like 200 people, for example, but then that 17% would be much smaller, or that pass-fail criteria would be much smaller because you're normally distributed. So more tests will be more tests closer to your mean. So you have smaller dispersion, which is your standard deviation, if you want the technical math term, which means that your confidence interval will also be shorter. For example, if they have a minimum of 10 people and they don't get this 17%, they can go up to 20. But if they go to 20 and they still don't get 17, then it's like, that's a failed test. Their sunscreen does not have the SPF that they claim.
Are they allowed to drop any of their results?
They can drop up to 5. So you can test a maximum of 25 because you can drop up to 5 and you can include 20 in your study, right?
Right. Okay, so you can drop a few outliers.
Yeah. So for example, if, I don't know, for some reason you exposed an individual and then you didn't see any reddening on their skin, it would be very difficult to figure out what the minimum dose was.
Absolutely.
And I guess, like, if you read some of these documents, these ISO standards, they have very strict instructions about how you're applying your sunscreen. In some cases, you can use a finger cut, and they have diagrams with the motions that need to be used to apply the sunscreen.
So this is what scares me, though, because as we've talked about, like, slapdash, let's get out of the house. I don't know about you, but I'm not like looking at the standards for the perfect diagram for application.
Neither am I. So I think at least what I took away from this is make sure you have full coverage.
I guess what we're really saying is this is the difference between efficacy and effectiveness.
Yeah.
Right?
The difference between your lab and your bedroom.
For our listeners who maybe haven't been taking research methods courses, which is totally fair. So efficacy is the performance of a product or an intervention. In this case, we're talking about sunscreen under those ideal circumstances.
Yeah.
So that's your 2 milligrams per centimeter squared, perfect application with perfect motion. But then there's effectiveness, which is performance under real world circumstances. So when you're at the beach and your child is squirming and you're trying to just get the sunscreen on somewhere, that there's your effectiveness. And there's differences in performance, right? So your SPF 30 might actually be an SPF 15, depending on how you applied it.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Shall we take a break and come back with some talk about the world?
Welcome back. We have talked a lot about what SPF is, how we calculate SPF, how we test SPF. But at the end of the day, I think what we're all wondering is, what does this mean? When we go to the drugstore and we're picking out a sunscreen, which do we pick?
Yes.
And that's a big question. But basically, there's two different camps of sunscreen.
Oh, wait. I think I know these two camps. Can I guess?
Oh, yes.
Is it chemical, which you have to wait for it to absorb into your skin after applying before you go outside? And then mineral, which you don't have to wait because it just reflects the sun.
Yes, you're absolutely right. So we have chemical sunscreen, which has to be absorbed. The way it protects you is it actually absorbs that UV radiation and then it converts it to a small amount of heat. And compounds that you'd find in there are oxybenzone, avobenzone, octosylate, octocrylene, homosalate, or octinazate. And then, like you said, mineral sunscreen, it's not that absorption and transformation of that energy. It's really a barrier. So you have to apply a generous amount because it has to reflect that UV. So you'll see compounds like zinc oxide or titanium dioxide in mineral sunscreen.
So do you know what chemical sunscreen reminds me of, Lindsay, or the way it works?
What does it remind you of?
Okay, I'm just going to say it because I'm a Trekkie and I'm just leaning into it. But it reminds me of how the shields on a starship work, like on the Enterprise. For example, if you are watching an episode and the Enterprise is under attack and I guess your weapons officer is like, shields down to 20% because the photon torpedoes are hitting the shields and dispersing the energy across the shields. Is that kind of like how the sunbeams hit your skin and the sunscreen disperses it into heat?
Yes, you are 10 out of 10 on an analogy here. I personally have never... I don't think I've ever seen a full episode of Star Trek.
I don't know if we can be friends. We'll watch one together.
So you are right on it with the analogy. So there's the two different methods that they really work under, right? But a question is, why should I pick one over the other? And recently, there's been a lot of controversy and concerns, I guess it would be the right word, about compounds in sunscreen. Specifically, oxybenzone gets most of the research and the news articles.
Yes, that is the scary chemical.
Yes.
Can you tell me how scared I need to be?
I'll walk you through some of the research. So basically, there was a specific article that came out in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And by the way, it's open source. So any of our listeners can go read it. We will have it in our show notes if anyone would like to. And basically what happened is the FDA started identifying that sunscreen ingredients that are absorbed systemically, so that don't just stay on your skin, they're absorbed, they go into your blood and elsewhere in your body. They should be assessed for toxicological effects. So basically we want to see whether or not there's harms that can be caused by this. For example, if they're carcinogenic or if there's concerns about endocrine disruption.
That sounds reasonable. I mean, if I am absorbing chemicals through my skin, I want to know that they're safe.
Absolutely. It makes sense. And I can't believe we weren't studying it before. But basically what happened in this Journal of the American Medical Association study is they looked at the active ingredients in chemical sunscreen, specifically avobenzone, oxybenzone, octocrylene, and ecamsule, which is a new one. I didn't know about that one, from 4 different sunscreens to see whether or not they're absorbed into systemic circulation, which is essentially the blood.
Okay. Because once it makes it into your blood, it can go everywhere.
Yes, pretty much. Except there's the blood-brain barrier, so there's more protection there, but that's neither here nor there in a totally different anatomy lesson.
Still important information.
Exactly. So what they found in this report was that these sunscreens led to a concentration in your blood plasma, which is a a part of your blood, which is
Yes.
all mixed in, but you can fraction it off. Anyways,
Yeah.
basically they found that the concentration that it reached in the blood exceeded the thresholds that the FDA set where toxicological testing wasn't necessary because it wasn't high enough. So we can't just leave it there.
Okay.
We have to do the toxicology testing. What the study is saying is not that the compounds are carcinogenic. It's that they have the potential to be carcinogenic, which as a consumer probably doesn't provide much comfort. But it is a distinction of just we have to do the testing on it because, we didn't realize it before, but they're absorbed systemically to the degree where we have to do that.
Yeah, which I guess, by the way, is how science works, right? Like we test and then we learn more and we test more and we learn more and we just keep adding on to our knowledge.
So we have that whole side of it with human health, but the flip side of that coin is planetary health.
Yes.
Right? What are these chemicals doing to our environment?
A very hot topic.
Absolutely. And a really timely one too, there's been a lot of documentaries about oceans and a lot of the concern is surrounding oceans because oxybenzones contribute to coral bleaching specifically.
Yes. I have heard if people were to get into the water wearing tons of sunscreen, then like as fish, for example, are like in the water, they would ingest this and it's not good for them.
Yeah, exactly. They can absorb it. And then there's concerns about it moving up the food chain, right? So if small fish get it, can it bioaccumulate to larger fish? And then we tend to eat the larger fish, which have bioaccumulated. All sorts of things. Like that's where concerns about like mercury in tuna are a big thing. It's a big issue, right? And Hawaii actually introduced into its legislature bills to ban oxybenzone in consumer products. And I believe that actually went into effect this January in 2021. But that's specifically oxybenzone, right? There's other options for SPF filters, right?
Is it just the chemical sunscreens that have this environmental impact? Or is it also the mineral sunscreens?
Most of the research that I found has been about the chemical sunscreens, and I haven't been seeing anything about mineral sunscreens. Like a lot of the recommendations in these journal articles are, we need to move towards using mineral sunscreens.
Okay.
Because it's not just issues with the fish either. Like it comes down to the coral too. What underlies coral bleaching is really stress on the coral.
Okay.
And then they expel all of their algae, which is part of what gives them that color that they have, their pigment. And without their algae, they're in danger of dying. So they aren't dead when they're bleached, but they're on their way.
So the expelling of the algae is the bleaching process.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. And there's a couple different leading theories, I guess you could say, about what the oxybenzone and specifically, chemical sunscreen does to the coral to precipitate this process, to cause stress. So there's some evidence for a direct toxic effect, like that it's directly a toxin to the coral. But then there's also evidence that sunscreens enhance viral production in seawater. So there's actually one of the things that's really interesting about coral is that there's a coral microbiome. So we talk about gut microbiomes all the time, right? So all the bacteria
that is so cool.
and viruses that live in your gut, but the corals have the same thing. It's really neat.
That is very cool.
So there's concerns about oxybenzone actually shifting that gut microbiome. Not gut microbiome.
The coral microbiome. The gut of the coral.
The gut of the coral. Which don't really have a gut. But there's concerns that there's changes being made to the microbiome of these corals with this stressor and this compound.
Okay.
And then there's also risks with fish reproduction.
Okay.
So there's been some evidence that oxybenzone leads to feminization of male fish.
What does that mean?
So they become more feminized, right? So they might not produce as much sperm for reproduction. And then that leads to obviously downstream consequences for the population. One final point about the risks of chemical sunscreen is that our typical wastewater treatment processes can't remove the chemicals.
Okay. So that makes it especially dangerous because we've put it in there, but we can't get it out and it's causing harm.
Wastewater treatment plants are traditionally designed for particulate matter.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also, they'll treat it with UV or chlorine or something to get some more of the
Yeah, to like
the
kill anything that might be
microorganisms.
live.
Exactly.
Mhm.
So there's concerns in the wastewater treatment process because we talked about how sometimes water is chlorinated
Mhm.
to clean it. But then UV filters can react with chlorine in water to create brominated transformation products,
Okay.
which can be detrimental, right? Like it's this reaction that's unintended in our water.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of downstream effects here, right? Like with oxybenzone specifically, a lot of the research is about, we have like the concerns in humans about it being systemic. And then there's all the concerns about the environment, about coral reef, about wastewater treatment, about feminization of male fish. And it's a lot on a type of sunscreen.
So it sounds like at least the recommendation from a lot of these papers that you're reading is to move to mineral sunscreen.
That's definitely the recommendation. But then there was a surprising number of papers that were concerned that if we remove oxybenzone as a compound, it'll wipe out so many products. Oxybenzone is one of the most common.
Is oxybenzone cheap to produce? Is that why it's so common?
That's a really good question, but I'm not totally sure, but I'm guessing that's probably part of it.
Okay.
That would make sense, right? If it's cheap to produce,
Yeah, I mean,
put it in everything.
it's either cheap or it's like really, really good if it's in so many of the products.
It actually isn't that great compared to other ones. There was a paper that I'll link it in the show notes, but there was a whole table in the paper about like which ones are the best. And oxybenzone wasn't even in like the top.
Okay.
It was one of the worst ones that was still acceptable because each one kind of has different ranges of light that it specializes in. And oxybenzone just wasn't the best one for sunscreen, for filtering, for protection. So my guess is it's probably really cheap to produce.
So it sounds like we could shift to mineral sunscreen, but there are probably other options that could be considered in the chemical sunscreen realm as well.
Yes, but we would probably want to do the same like rigorous research that we're doing on oxybenzone on those compounds to make sure that they aren't causing the same problem, but we're just not seeing them in those high volumes that we're seeing specifically oxybenzone in.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes. Oxybenzone was tied for last place for broad spectrum performance. It's an article in the Journal of Cosmetic Dermatology, and it'll be linked in our show notes. So it's tied for last place. So it must be cheap.
All right. So, Lindsay, we've talked a lot about some of the concerns around sunscreen, their impacts in the world. We've also talked about how SPF is calculated, but can you give us some advice about how we should pick a sunscreen and perhaps how we should apply it or use it?
Okay. So for this, because I am not a dermatologist or a doctor at this point.
Not yet.
I have many, many years to go until then. So I have deferred to the Canadian Dermatological Association.
Good choice.
Exactly. What are the recommendations? What are they saying? Because they are truly the experts in this.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, they have an expert advisory board that reviews different sunscreen products. And if you go into a store and you look at all the different sunscreens, some of them will have a seal or an emblem on them from the Canadian Dermatological Association, meaning that it's met the criteria that the advisory board uses to determine, is this a good sunscreen? Should we be recommending this? And you can find more information about that. And I believe also a list of products on their website. Their criteria is, the sunscreen is broad spectrum, so it covers UVA, UVB. They want SPF 30 or higher.
Okay.
They're looking for formulations that have a low potential for irritation. So, they don't want sunscreen that's causing a bunch of rashes. And part of that, too, is they're looking for minimal perfume or non-perfumed. and then non-comedogenic. The thing is, though, they recommend, sunscreens that fit that bill. They recognize those. They have the seal on the packaging. But one of the things that's really clear is that sunscreen's only one of the things that we should be doing to protect our skin from sun exposure. And a few other recommendations that they have were avoiding peak sun hours, which are usually 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., finding the shade, wearing a hat, clothing with UPF, which is a sun protection factor in fabric, actually.
Wow.
All of those things are just as important as wearing sunscreen. It's all part of the picture.
Are there any recommendations on how to apply it?
Not that I could find. Generously is my guess, in every 2 hours or after swimming or sweating.
I did see after 2 hours when I was looking at the standards.
That seems to be the rule of thumb. So now that we've talked about what kind of sunscreen we should all be wearing and other sun safety tips, it's time to plant our science seed.
Ooh.
It is now time for the cheesiest part of our show.
I love it so much.
Me too. Each episode, we like to give our listeners something to think about, a science nugget, if you will, to help you think more critically about the numbers and statistics you hear every day.
All right. So this episode, we talked a lot about chemicals, oxybenzone in particular. We spent a little bit of time talking about. And what we really wanted to do is unpack what a chemical actually is. What is its definition? Because it's a really emotionally charged word in public spaces. So many people hear the word chemical and they can get scared because perhaps it has negative connotation. And it's true that there are chemicals that are toxic, such as methylmercury, but the neurotransmitters in your brain are also chemicals. Pretty much everything in the world is a chemical, even water. Even benign chemicals can have lethal doses if they're taken in a large enough quantity.
Excellent. So, in the most basic sense, pardon the pun because we're talking about chemistry, a chemical is any substance containing matter. So, it can be liquid or solid, gas, it can be a mixture, it can be a pure substance, it can be natural, which means, it occurs naturally in nature, or it can be synthesized in a lab, for example. To break it down even further, matter is a physical substance that occupies space and has mass, which is different from energy, which does not occupy space or have mass. So one thing that's really important to note about these definitions is that they're entirely neutral. They don't attach a feeling or positive or negative connotation to the words. They're just what they are. It's chemical, it's matter.
So that's why, for example, when we talk about oxybenzone, we say that they have a potential to cause harm, but we don't yet know.
Yeah, we have a high suspicion. Yeah, it's something that still needs to be studied. And I think a lot of times we talk about, it's filled with chemicals, and that's a bad thing. But if you think about it in the chemical definition, everything's filled with chemicals, right? The glass of water that you're drinking is filled with chemicals.
Yeah. So I guess a takeaway is to take a step back and not be afraid of chemicals, and rather just have a think about them.
I think that's really important. And also be very wary when people are selling products that they claim are chemical free. I know that's not possible. Thanks for listening, everyone. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you find your podcasts. You can find the references we used for this episode in our show notes. A special thank you to Julian Bertino, who does our sound editing and music. We'll catch you next time on The Secret Life of Numbers, where the numbers can run,
but they can't hide.